A proper term for the Safavid society is what we today can call a meritocracy, meaning a society in which officials were appointed on the basis of worth and merit, and not on the basis of birth. It was certainly not an oligarchy, nor was it an aristocracy. Sons of nobles were considered for the succession of their fathers as a mark of respect, but they had to prove themselves worthy of the position. This system avoided an entrenched aristocracy or a caste society. There even are numerous recorded accounts of laymen that rose to high official posts, as a result of their merits. Nevertheless, the Persian society during the Safavids was that of a hierarchy, with the Shah at the apex of the hierarchical pyramid, the common people, merchants and peasants at the base, and the aristocrats in between. The term dawlat, which in modern Persian means government, was then an abstract term meaning bliss or felicity, and it began to be used as concrete sense of the Safavid state, reflecting the view that the people had of their ruler, as someone elevated above humanity. Also among the aristocracy, in the middle of the hierarchical pyramid, were the religious officials, who, mindful of the historic role of the religious classes as a buffer between the ruler and his subjects, usually did their best to shield the ordinary people from oppressive governments. The customs and culture of the people. Jean Chardin devoted a whole chapter in his book to describing the Persian character, which apparently fascinated him greatly. As he spent a large bulk of his life in Persia, he involved himself in, and took part in, their everyday rituals and habits, and eventually acquired intimate knowledge of their culture, customs, and character. He admired their consideration towards foreigners, but he also stumbled upon characteristics that he found challenging. His descriptions of the public appearance, clothes, and customs are corroborated by the miniatures, drawings and paintings from that time which have survived. As he describes them, their imagination is animated, quick, and fruitful. Their memory is free and prolific. They are very favorably drawn to the sciences, the liberal and mechanical arts. Their temperament is open and leans towards sensual pleasure and self-indulgence, which makes them pay little attention to economy or business. He then goes on. They are very philosophical over the good and bad things in life and about expectations for the future. They are little tainted with avarice, desiring only to acquire in order to spend. They love to enjoy what is to hand and they refuse nothing which contributes to it, having no anxiety about the future which they leave to providence and fate. But as he also experienced, the Persians are dissembling, shamelessly deceitful and the greatest flatterers in the world, using great deception and insolence. They lack good faith in business dealings, in which they cheat so adeptly that one is always taken in. Hypocrisy is the usual disguise in which they proceed. They say their prayers and perform their rituals in the most devout manner. They hold the wisest and most pious conversation of which they are capable. And although they are naturally inclined to humanity, hospitality, mercy, and other worldly goods, nevertheless, they do not cease feigning in order to give the semblance of being much better than they really are. It is however no question, from reading Chardin's descriptions of their manners, that he considered them to be a well-educated and well-behaved people, who certainly knew the strict etiquettes of social intercourse. As he describes them, the Persians are the most civilized of the peoples of the East, and what the French are to Europe, they are to the Orient. Their bearing and countenance is the best composed, mild, serious, impressive, genial, and welcoming as far as possible. They never fail to perform at once the appropriate gestures of politeness when meeting each other. They are the most wheedling people in the world, with the most engaging manners, the most supple spirits and a language that is gentle and flattering, and devoid of unpleasant terms but rather full of circumlocutions. Unlike Europeans, they much disliked physical activity, and were not in favor of exercise for its own sake, preferring the leisure of repose and luxuries that life could offer. Traveling was valued only for the specific purpose of getting from one place to another, not interesting themselves in seeing new places and experiencing different cultures. It was perhaps the sort of attitude towards the rest of the world that accounted for the ignorance of Persians regarding other countries of the world. The exercises that they took part in were for keeping the body supple and sturdy and to acquire skills in handling of arms. Archery took first place. Second place was held by fencing, where the wrist had to be firm but flexible and movements agile. Thirdly, there was horsemanship. A very strenuous form of exercise which the Persians greatly enjoyed was hunting. Since pre-Islamic times, the sport of wrestling had been an integral part of the Iranian identity, and the professional wrestlers, who performed in zurkhanas, were considered important members of the society. Each town had their own troupe of wrestlers, called palavans. Their sport also provided the masses with entertainment and spectacle. Chardin described one such event. The two wrestlers were covered in grease. They are present on the level ground, and a small drum is always playing during the contest for excitement. They swear to a good fight and shake hands. That done, they slap their thighs, buttocks, and hips to the rhythm of the drum. That is for the women and to get themselves in good form. After that they join together in uttering a great cry and trying to overthrow each other. As well as wrestling, what gathered the masses was fencing, tightrope dancers, puppet players, and acrobats, performing in large squares, such as the Royal Square. A leisurely form of amusement was to be found in the cabarets, particularly in certain districts, like those near the mausoleum of Harun-e-Vilayat. People met there to drink liqueurs or coffee, to smoke tobacco or opium, and to chat or listen to poetry. As noted before, a key aspect of the Persian character was its love of luxury, particularly on keeping up appearances. They would adorn their clothes, wearing stones, and decorate the harness of their horses. Men wore many rings on their fingers, almost as many as their wives. They also placed jewels on their arms, such as on daggers and swords. Daggers were worn at the waist. In describing the ladies' clothing, he noted that Persian dress revealed more of the figure than did the European, but that women appeared differently depending on whether they were at home in the presence of friends and family, or if they were in the public. In private they usually wore a veil that only covered the hair and the back, but upon leaving the home, they put on mantos, large cloaks that concealed their whole bodies except their faces. They often dyed their feet and hands with henna. Their hairstyle was simple, the hair gathered back in tresses, often adorned at the ends with pearls and clusters of jewels. Women with slender waists were regarded as more attractive than those with larger figures. Women from the provinces and slaves pierced their left nostrils with rings, but well-born Persian women would not do this. The most precious accessory for men was the turban. Although they lasted a long time, it was necessary to have changes for different occasions like weddings and the Nowruz, while men of status never wore the same turban 2 days running. Clothes that became soiled in any way were changed immediately. Although the Safavid rulers and citizens were of native stock and continuously reasserted their Iranian identity, the power structure of the Safavid state was mainly divided into two groups: the Turkic-speaking military/ruling elite whose job was to maintain the territorial integrity and continuity of the Iranian Empire through their leadership, and the Persian-speaking administrative/governing elite whose job was to oversee the operation and development of the nation and its identity through their high positions. Thus came the term Turk and Tajik, which was used by native Iranians for many generations to describe the Persianate, or Turco-Persian, nature of many dynasties which ruled over Greater Iran between the 12th and 20th centuries, in that these dynasties promoted and helped continue the dominant Persian linguistic and cultural identity of their states, although the dynasties themselves were of non-Persian, e.g. Turkic, linguistic origins. The relationship between the Turkic-speaking Turks and Persian-speaking Tajiks was symbiotic, yet some form of rivalry did exist between the two. As the former represented the people of the sword and the latter, the people of the pen, high-level official posts would naturally be reserved for the Persians. Indeed, this had been the situation throughout Persian history, even before the Safavids, ever since the Arab conquest. Shah Tahmasp introduced a change to this, when he, and the other Safavid rulers who succeeded him, sought to blur the formerly defined lines between the two linguistic groups, by taking the sons of Turkic-speaking officers into the royal household for their education in the Persian language. Consequently, they were slowly able to take on administrative jobs in areas which had hitherto been the exclusive preserve of the ethnic Persians. From 1540 and onwards, Shah Tahmasp initiated a transformation of the society by slowly constructing a new branch within the aristocracy. The campaigns that he waged against Georgia between 1540 and 1554 were primarily meant to uphold the morale and the fighting efficiency of the Qizilbash military, but they brought home large numbers, over 70,000, of Georgian, Circassian and Armenian slaves. The women, only Circassian and Georgian, came to occupy prominent positions in the harems of the Safavid elite, particularly the Shahs, while the men were given special training, on completion of which they were either enrolled in one of the newly created Ghulam regiments, or employed in the royal household. His successor Ismail II brought another 30,000 Circassians and Georgians to Iran, of which many joined the Ghulam force, but it was under Shah Abbas who significantly enlarged this program and greatly expanded the Ghulam military corps from a few hundred to 15,000 highly trained cavalrymen, as part of a whole army division of 40,000 Caucasian Ghulams. He then went on to reduce the number of Qizilbash provincial governorships and systematically moved Qizilbash governors to other districts, thus disrupting their ties with the local community, and reducing their power. Many were replaced by a Ghulam, and within short time, Georgians, Circassians, and Armenians had been appointed to many of the highest offices of state. By 1595, Aliverdi Khan, a Georgian, became one of the most powerful men in the Safavid state, when he was appointed the Governor-General of Fars, one of the richest provinces in Persia. And his power reached its peak in 1598, when he became the Commander-in-Chief of the armed forces. Thus, this new group eventually came to constitute a powerful third force within the state, alongside the Persians and the Qizilbash Turks, and it only goes to prove the meritocratic society of the Safavids. It is estimated that during Abbas' reign some 130,000 to 200,000 Georgians, tens of thousands of Circassians, and around 300,000 Armenians had been deported from the Caucasus to Persia's heartland, all obtaining functions and roles such as the highest of the state, or as simple farmers and peasantry. Emergence of a clerical aristocracy. An important feature of the Safavid society was the alliance that emerged between the ulama, the religious class, and the merchant community. The latter included merchants trading in the bazaars, the trade and artisan guilds, asnf, and members of the quasi-religious organizations run by dervishes, feudava. Because of the relative insecurity of property ownership in Persia, many private landowners secured their lands by donating them to the clergy as so-called vakf. They would thus retain the official ownership and secure their land from being confiscated by royal commissioners or local governors, as long as a percentage of the revenues from the land went to the ulama. Increasingly, members of the religious class, particularly the mujtahids and the sides, gained full ownership of these lands, and, according to contemporary historian Iskandar Munshi, Persia started to witness the emergence of a new and significant group of landowners. Akbaris versus Yuzulis. The Akbari movement crystallized as a separate movement with the writings of Muhammad Amin al-Astarabadi, died 1627 AD. It rejected the use of reasoning in deriving verdicts and believed that only the Quran, Hadith, prophetic sayings and recorded opinions of the Imams, and consensus should be used as sources to derive verdicts, fatwa. Unlike Yuzulis, Akbari did and do not follow marjas who practice ijtihad. It achieved its greatest influence in the late Safavid and early post-Safavid era, when it dominated 12 Shia Islam. However, shortly thereafter Muhammad Baqir Bibahani, died 1792, along with other Yuzuli mujtahids, crushed the Akbari movement. It remains only a small minority in the Shia Muslim world. One result of the resolution of this conflict was the rise in importance of the concept of ijtihad and the position of the mujtahid, as opposed to other ulama, in the 18th and early 19th centuries. It was from this time that the division of the Shia world into mujtahid, those who could follow their own independent judgment, and muqallid, those who had to follow the rulings of a mujtahid, took place. According to author Mujan Momin, up to the middle of the 19th century there were very few mujtahids, 3 or 4, anywhere at any one time, but several hundred existed by the end of the 19th century. Allama Majlisi. Muhammad Bakir Majlisi, commonly referenced to using the title Allama, was a highly influential scholar during the 17th century, Safavid era. Majlisi's works emphasized his desire to purge Twelver Shi'ism of the influences of mysticism and philosophy, and to propagate an ideal of strict adherence to the Islamic law, Sharia. Majlisi promoted specifically Shia rituals such as mourning for Hussein ibn Ali and visitation, ziyarat, of the tombs of the Imams and Imamzadas, stressing the concept of the Imams as mediators and intercessors for man with God. State and government. The Safavid state was one of checks and balance, both within the government and on a local level. At the apex of this system was the Shah, with total power over the state, legitimized by his bloodline as a Sayyid, or descendant of Muhammad. So absolute was his power, that the French merchant, and later ambassador to Persia, Jean Chardin thought the Safavid Shahs ruled their land with an iron fist and often in a despotic manner. To ensure transparency and avoid decisions being made that circumvented the Shah, a complex system of bureaucracy and departmental procedures had been put in place that prevented fraud. Every office had a deputy or superintendent, whose job was to keep records of all actions of the state officials and report directly to the Shah. The Shah himself exercised his own measures for keeping his ministers under control by fostering an atmosphere of rivalry and competitive surveillance. And since the Safavid society was meritocratic, and successions seldom were made on the basis of heritage, this meant that government offices constantly felt the pressure of being under surveillance and had to make sure they governed in the best interest of their leader, and not merely their own. The government. There probably did not exist any parliament, as we know them today. But the Portuguese ambassador to the Safavids, de Gouveia, still mentions the Council of State in his records, which perhaps was a term for governmental gatherings of the time. The highest level in the government was that of the Prime Minister, or Grand Vizier, Etamadi Dawlat, who was always chosen from among doctors of law. He enjoyed tremendous power and control over national affairs as he was the immediate deputy of the Shah. No act of the Shah was valid without the counter seal of the Prime Minister. But even he stood accountable to a deputy, Vacanevis, who kept records of his decision-makings and notified the Shah. Second to the Prime Minister post were the General of the Revenues, Mustafa Yemamalek, or Finance Minister 166, and the Divan Beji, Minister of Justice. The latter was the final appeal in civil and criminal cases, and his office stood next to the main entrance to the Ali Kapı Palace. In earlier times, the Shah had been closely involved in judicial proceedings, but this part of the royal duty was neglected by Shah Safi and the later kings. Next in authority were the generals, the general of the royal troops, the Shahsevans, general of the musketeers, general of the gulams, and the master of artillery. A separate official, the commander-in-chief, was appointed to be the head of these officials. As for the royal household, the highest post was that of the Nazir, court minister. He was perhaps the closest advisor to the Shah, and, as such, functioned as his eyes and ears within the court. His primary job was to appoint and supervise all the officials of the household and to be their contact with the Shah. But his responsibilities also included that of being the treasurer of the Shah's properties. This meant that even the Prime Minister, who held the highest office in the state, had to work in association with the Nazir when it came to managing those transactions that directly related to the Shah. The second most senior appointment was the Grand Steward, Ichik Agassi Bashi, who would always accompany the Shah and was easily recognizable because of the great baton that he carried with him. He was responsible for introducing all guests, receiving petitions presented to the Shah and reading them if required. Next in line were the Master of the Royal Stables, Mirakir Bashi, and the Master of the Hunt, Mirshakar Bashi. The Shah had stables in all the principal towns, and Shah Abbas was said to have about 30,000 horses in studs around the country. In addition to these, there were separate officials appointed for the caretaking of royal banquets and for entertainment. Chardin specifically noticed the rank of doctors and astrologers and the respect that the Shahs had for them. The Shah had a dozen of each in his service and would usually be accompanied by 3 doctors and 3 astrologers, who were authorized to sit by his side on various occasions. The chief physician, Hakim Bashi, was a highly considered member of the royal court, and the most revered astrologer of the court was given the title Munajim Bashi, chief astrologer. During the 1st century of the dynasty, the primary court language remained Azari, although this increasingly changed after the capital was moved to Isfahan. Local governments. On a local level, the government was divided into public land and royal possessions. The public land was under the rule of local governors, or khans. Since the earliest days of the Safavid dynasty, the Qizilbash generals had been appointed to most of these posts. They ruled their provinces like petty shahs and spent all their revenues on their own province, only presenting the Shah with the balance. In return, they had to keep ready a standing army at all times and provide the Shah with military assistance upon his request. It was also requested from them that they appoint a lawyer, vakil, to the court who would inform them on matters pertaining to the provincial affairs. Shah Abbas I intended to decrease the power of the Qizilbash by bringing some of these provinces into his direct control, creating so-called crown provinces, Kasa. But it was Shah Safi, under influence by his prime minister, Sarutaki, that initiated the program of trying to increase the royal revenues by buying land from the governors and putting in place local commissioners. In time, this proved to become a burden to the people that were under the direct rule of the Shah, as these commissioners, unlike the former governors, had little knowledge about the local communities that they controlled and were primarily interested in increasing the income of the Shah. And, while it was in the governor's own interest to increase the productivity and prosperity of their provinces, the commissioners received their income directly from the royal treasury and, as such, did not care so much about investing in agriculture and local industries. Thus, the majority of the people suffered from rapacity and corruption carried out in the name of the Shah. Democratic institutions in a totalitarian society. In 16th and 17th century Iran, there existed a considerable number of local democratic institutions. Examples of such were the trade and artisan guilds, which had started to appear in Persia from the 1500s. Also, there were the quasi-religious fraternities called feudava, which were run by local dervishes. Another official selected by the consensus of the local community was the Kadkota, who functioned as a common law administrator. The local sheriff, Kalantar, who was not elected by the people but directly appointed by the Shah, and whose function was to protect the people against injustices on the part of the local governors, supervised the Kadkota. In Safavid Persia there was little distinction between theology and jurisprudence, or between divine justice and human justice, and it all went under Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh. The legal system was built up of 2 branches, civil law, which had its roots in Sharia, received wisdom, and urf, meaning traditional experience and very similar to the Western form of common law. While the imams and judges of law applied civil law in their practice, urf was primarily exercised by the local commissioners, who inspected the villages on behalf of the Shah, and by the Minister of Justice, Divan Baji. The latter were all secular functionaries working on behalf of the Shah 174. The highest level in the legal system was the Minister of Justice, and the law officers were divided into senior appointments, such as the magistrate, Darapa, inspector, vizier, and recorder, Vacanevis. The lesser officials were the Qazi, corresponding a civil lieutenant, who ranked under the local governors and functioned as judges in the provinces. According to Chardin, there were no particular place assigned for the administration of justice. Each magistrate executes justice in his own house in a large room opening onto a courtyard or a garden which is raised 2 or 3 feet above the ground. The judge is seated at one end of the room having a writer and a man of law by his side. Chardin also noted that bringing cases into court in Persia was easier than in the West. The judge, Qazi, was informed of relevant points involved and would decide whether or not to take up the case. Having agreed to do so, a sergeant would investigate and summon the defendant, who was then obliged to pay the fee of the sergeant. The two parties with their witnesses pleaded their respective cases, usually without any counsel, and the judge would pass his judgment after the first or second hearing. Criminal justice was entirely separate from civil law and was judged upon common law administered through the Minister of Justice, local governors, and the court minister, the Nazir. Despite being based on urf, it relied upon certain sets of legal principles. Murder was punishable by death, and the penalty for bodily injuries was invariably the bastinado. Robbers had their right wrists amputated the first time, and sentenced to death on any subsequent occasion. State criminals were subjected to the karkan, a triangular wooden collar placed around the neck. On extraordinary occasions when the Shah took justice into his own hand, he would dress himself up in red for the importance of the event, according to ancient tradition.